Does the United States already face a constitutional crisis? At what point does a president's rule by decree manner of governing take a 2-century-old democracy into unchartered territory? 1 month back in office, and the executive orders just keep on coming. One of Donald Trump's latest, the one stating that only he and his attorney general, what we call here the justice minister, can interpret what the law is for government bodies, even the independent ones. Is the White House breaking down the firewall with the Federal Reserve, the guarantor of the U.S. dollar? A right to control oversight bodies like Wall Street's watchdog, the Securities and Exchange Commission? Those who still have faith in the system insist that in the end, the courts will reject whatever is unconstitutional. But what if this White House ignores the courts? What if there is no effective pushback from lawmakers, who, by the way, under the Constitution, still hold the power of the purse? Trump's already pushed new boundaries, bringing in an unvetted private citizen to take an axe to what Elon Musk deems as wasteful government spending. For democracy to die, what if there is no need for a referendum or another January 6th? What if all it takes is cherry-picking what laws you decide to enforce and what institutions you decide to dismantle? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking what future for U.S. democracy? With us from Washington, Republican strategist Dan Hazelwood, president of Targeted Creative Communications. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Thanks to be back. Appreciate it.
From New York, former U.S. federal prosecutor Frederick Davis, lecturer in law at Columbia University. Good to see you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Also in New York, journalist Casey Michel, your latest book, Foreign Agents: How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. Welcome to the show.
Very happy to be here.
Vivian Walt is Paris correspondent for Time Magazine. How are you doing?
Very good.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. Talk about the almighty stroke of the pen. The new U.S. president can rename entire oceanic basins or do away with those soggy paper straws.
These things don't work. I've had them many times, and on occasion they break, they explode. If something's hot, they don't last very long, like a matter of minutes, sometimes a matter of seconds. It's a ridiculous situation. So we're going back to plastic straws. And I don't think that plastic's going to affect a shark very much as they're munching their way through the ocean. Okay.
You know that saying, Vivian Walt, that Ronald Reagan was an actor and Donald Trump a stand-up comedian. And it's true that you chuckle when you hear him talk about straws. Is this something a bit of fun? Are we being sucked in when we draw attention to something like him reinstating plastic straws, or is this part of a grand communication scheme?
Sucked in, so to speak. Look, Donald Trump is a climate denier, as they say, and he, for the second time, has pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord. Last time it had no effect, and I think that he truly is kind of angry about that. Well, I think what strikes me, and I am kind of curious to hear what the others on the panel think from the U.S. Point of view. But what strikes me is the kind of pettiness that runs through Trump's executive orders, these kind of almost childish small acts that are thrown in with very big acts, and they all kind of mix together.
It's exactly it that we're describing, and we saw it in every day. There's this sort of diet of decrees that compete with one another for attention. Tuesday's topper stateside, an order facilitating in vitro fertilization, ahead of one that quietly but significantly turbocharges the powers of the White House and specifically its office that works on the federal budget.
This executive order would establish important oversight functions in the Office of Management and Budget and its subsidiary office, OIRA, supervising independent agencies and many of their actions, and also reestablishes the longstanding norm that only the President or the Attorney General can speak for the United States when stating an opinion as to what the law is.
Frederick Davis, that last sentence, is it true that only the President or the Attorney General can speak for the United States when it comes to legal matters?
Well, that's a big question. Courts have a point of view on this as well. Look, we have a complex system of government where the executive and the legislature and the courts share power to interpret the laws. For 200 and some years, the notion has been that ultimately it's a judicial function to look at the law and interpret to state what it is. And Trump doesn't like that. He pushes back, but I don't think the courts are going to immediately give up. What he is doing is he's overwhelming the system by being essentially a revolutionary. He's just coming out, as you pointed out, daily with these new decrees, some of which, probably fall squarely within his powers, some not. But he knows that to push back through the courts or elsewhere takes a long while, and meanwhile he'll merrily go on and do more things. But he's wrong when he says that only the executive can interpret the law. And the crisis we may face is whether the courts push back on that.
And so this particular executive order, does it mean that, for instance, the White House can say to the Securities and Exchange Commission what it can regulate and what it can't on Wall Street? Does it mean that he can tell the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve whether or not to lower or raise interest rates?
Well, each of those is a separate question. The SEC was established by Congress, the Federal Reserve is established by Congress, and they have certain powers. I think the real issue, though, is what happens among voters. Because if he keeps pushing one way or another against the SEC, he can affect appointments, he can affect who's there, but he's really affecting the public debate about it. And if he wins that public debate, namely that the SEC has to follow him, then we're in really bad shape. If he loses that, namely people push back, they tell their local representatives, we don't want to go in that direction, he won't succeed. So it's not purely a legal issue. There are legal issues there. The courts can't rule on them. I think ultimately we have to keep sight of the fact that, more importantly, it's a political issue.
You don't sound in a panic. You think that the courts will, in the end, have the final say.
I'm in a panic. Look, there are three separate issues. One is, has Trump changed democracy? Second, has he weakened it? And third, is there a risk that democracy is just going to be done away with, right? And I think the answer to the first is yes, democracy is changing, in part because of demographic issues. The Democratic coalition that's been there for a long while is splintering. And Trump is a revolutionary. He's changed how politics works. Is it being weakened? I think so. In part, though, it's because he's affecting policies that I don't like. And that's not quite the same thing as saying that democracy is weakened. Where I'm really worried is his impact on the respect people have for the institutions of government, particularly the courts. The degree to which people respect the courts has plummeted in the last few years. Every time any judge rules against Trump, Trump within nanoseconds says, well, he's corrupt or she's corrupt. And some of these are people I know very well who are the opposite of corrupt. But what he's doing is he's diminishing the respect we have for our institutions. And that is a very subtle but really noxious way to undermine democracy.
Dan Hazelwood, do you agree?
I agree in part. There's a bunch of things. Frederick Davis wants to talk about the campaign side. I want to talk about the legal side, which is funny. We're both trying to walk in each other's shoes a little bit here. I think it's true that Trump is trying to change and transform stuff. A lot of this is what he told us he was going to try and achieve in the campaign. But people also need to understand this struggle over the powers of the president, of the judiciary, and of the legislature are as old as the American Constitution itself. We're going to go on. The courts are going to win their fights. They're going to issue their rulings. Trump is trying to change things that people thought were law, but in fact were rules that were delegated to the power of the president. As an old school conservative, I've argued for years and years that Congress should be more specific in the powers it grants the president and has it more tailored. I sort of reject the notion that this is just Trump attacking our institutions. I mean, we just had a president in Biden who announced that, there's a new amendment to the Constitution of the United States. We had a president under Obama who incorrectly criticized the Supreme Court to their face at a State of the Union. The Democrats were saying if the courts don't rule our way, we're going to pack the Supreme Court. They called for impeaching Republican justices. It is part of the democratic system that is unfortunate, but it is true, that politicians get to talk, courts get to rule, and then the politicians get to complain. This is normal. It's not a crisis, it's just uncomfortable. And we are having a real hard debate that is uncomfortable about the direction and powers of the president and the direction of our country on issues. And Trump is pretty much doing what he said. I mean, the IVF is something that he said he would do, just as he said he was going to actually go after the federal bureaucracy and try and cut it significantly. We're seeing him do that.
Further to Frederick Davis's point about this criticizing not just the judiciary, but criticizing judges by name and accusing them of being corrupt. Do you agree that that undermines democracy?
I think that both sides have, for a generation or more, have engaged in criticisms of both the judiciary. The judiciary is on the playing field in the American political system. It is not some unique silent body, and both parties have gone after them repeatedly on many occasions. So I think it's a big mistake for people to say, oh, this is just Trump, because it's not just Trump. It's both sides. Would we all like a more dignified world? Yes, absolutely, include me in that. But that's not the way the system works. When a court rules against you, you get to complain. You adhere to it, and even famously Donald Trump said, I think last week, I always follow the courts. He will comply with the court rulings because the whole system will comply with the court rulings when we get to the final stages. But people need to understand, and I think Frederick Davis probably does this infinitely better than I do, sometimes these processes are long, they're detailed, and we can talk about some of these executive orders and the court challenges going on. They're, in some cases, actually very complicated technical matters.
But you have the old adage, see you in court, but you have to recognize the authority of the courts. Dan Hazelwood, Yale Law School graduate J.D. Vance tweeted 10 days ago how if a judge tries to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the attorney general in how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. That shocked people on this side of the Atlantic.
Well, and Frederick Davis was just alluding to this point. Actually, there are certain areas where the executive does have power to exercise authority and is not constrained by the judiciary. There are certain areas, famously the Bill of Rights, where the executive is constrained by the legal system. So the details really matter on this, and one of the bad things that's occurring in our political dialogue is the rhetoric is escalating on both sides, and I would say everybody's guilty of just escalating rhetoric that is losing sight of what's actually some of these issues at stake.
Casey Michel, you agree?
I think Dan and Frederick both make some points that are certainly worth considering. And I think Dan is exactly right that many of these topics, many of these policies have certainly been debated throughout American history, and certainly many of the more authoritarian, at least statements, if not policies as of yet out of the Trump administration do have precedent. Go back to the days of Richard Nixon and his using of whether the Department of Justice or the Internal Revenue Service to target political enemies. You can also, of course, go all the way back to the days of Andrew Jackson and his apocryphal quote of saying, the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. You know, Francois, you started this conversation by asking if we are in a constitutional crisis here in the United States of America. I would say as of right now, here we are on February 19th, no, we are not in a constitutional crisis as of yet, but you can certainly see how the contours of one would emerge. Of course, J.D. Vance's tweet being an exhibit of what would potentially come down the line and potentially very soon if the Trump administration does receive a ruling that is not to its favor, that it does not like. And President Trump says, or potentially posts on Truth Social, Chief Justice Roberts has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Now, of course, there are enforcement mechanisms, contempt of court, et cetera, that are available to the court system in the United States of America. But it has certainly been a very long time Since we have seen that kind of pressure point emerge, would not be surprised if we do see that in the relatively near future in the United States.
Are the system of checks and balances that are taught in political science classes the world over, is that still intact after 1 month of Trump?
Well, they're certainly still there in theory, but I think the biggest surprise for a lot of folks in the first month of this new Trump administration is just how little Congress seems to make its presence felt, and in fact, how willing it is to give up the powers that are appropriated to Congress itself. It has been surprising to see just how willingly congressional Republicans especially have rolled over in the face of some of these executive orders. I will say, on my end, the most concerning thing is to see the Trump administration's, again, theoretically, there are these theoretical underpinnings to this, but certainly approach to eliminating the previous independence of the Department of Justice. And of course, there are all manner of knock-on effects related to that, ending prosecutions of Trump allies, decimating the United States of America's anti-corruption policies, on and on and on. And again, we're only a month into the new Trump administration. I am extremely concerned what we're going to see in that space moving forward.
Frederick Davis, just a quick question on this, practically speaking. You talked about friends who are sitting judges today. If one of those sitting judges said, arrest this or that person, could there be a situation? Is it a far-fetched idea that the Justice Department could tell the U.S. Marshals not to arrest said person?
Well, I think we all agree that there's a red line that could happen out there if there is a judicial order where the executive branch, in particular Trump, says, I'm not going to respect it.
That hasn't been crossed.
Pardon?
That has not been crossed.
Yeah, that's not been crossed yet.
Okay.
He is really good at what I think of as a gaslighting. Namely, he's sort of suggested through Vance and others that the time might come when we have to do that. Why does he do that? Because it's a win-win. One is about 30% of the population agrees with him. He then gets outraged from people like me who get outraged, and then it's on page one. He loves being on page one, even with negative news. Plus, there's this process of renormalization, of sort of, restating what is normal. You remember that on January 6, 2021, there was an attempted putsch in this country. And if any of my colleagues think it really wasn't all that bad, I disagree. That was an attempted attempt by violence to disregard the Constitution. Fortunately, it did not work. The institutions held up. What we're seeing now, though, is a rewriting history. He pardons all of them, including people who were very violent, saying they were patriots. And that's just an attempt at subtle and not so subtle renormalization that I think is extremely dangerous. So you asked me earlier, am I panicked? I mean, I'm real concerned about this, yes.
In an interview with Fox News, Donald Trump and Elon Musk together, reassuring the moderator, Sean Hannity, that the boss of Starlink and SpaceX would, of course, recuse himself if ever there was a conflict of interest with his DOGE federal cost-cutting department.
I mean, I haven't asked the president for anything ever.
And if it comes up, how will you handle it?
Well,
he won't be involved.
Yeah, I'll recuse myself if it is.
If there's a conflict, he won't be involved.
Yeah,
I mean, I wouldn't want that, and he won't want it.
Right.
He would recuse himself. Your reaction, Vivian Wald? I
mean, Elon Musk has billions at stake here. He has billions in contracts with the federal government. Entire companies of his rest on federal approvals of various kinds, including as well as procurement and contracts and so on. So for him to say, well, if it ever comes to that, of course, I'll recuse himself is, I guess, a little ludicrous.
Well, let's go to a specific case. His Starlink low-orbit satellite system, it still hasn't got this contract through with South Africa, and now Donald Trump putting on the heat on South Africa.
Absolutely.
Are the two linked?
Oh, undoubtedly, I'm sure. Absolutely. I mean, that's a little bit of a complicated question because Elon Musk is also a South African-born, person. So he has a certain complicated relationship with his native country. But there is no doubt that there is some kind of link between the Starlink contract and Trump's pressure on South Africa, and that might be multiplied many times over across the globe because Starlink is operating in dozens of countries.
Casey Michel, is there oversight when it comes to what's going on? Because it is Donald Trump putting the heat on South Africa and Elon Musk who's trying to get that contract.
No, absolutely. There's no oversight, either out of Congress, where theoretically it should be taking place, or, of course, within the administration itself. I mean, frankly, I think if folks are taking Elon Musk at his word at this point, I have some wonderful ocean view property in Switzerland to sell them, because those people are suckers top to bottom. And, of course, Elon has every interest to make sure he is involved in these conversations, because he knows full well that Trump's Justice Department, if push does come to shove and any criminal acts do take place, that is as pliant of a Department of Justice as we have seen in decades. There is no concern out of the administration or its allies that Trump's Department of Justice will target them, will indict them, and will bring them to court. No concern whatsoever.
No concern whatsoever. And so, Vivian Walt, at this point in time, what does that say about rule of law and sort of the view that people in your native South Africa have of the United States?
True. I come out of the same, authoritarian country that Elon Musk comes out of.
And by the way, there were pro-Trump demonstrations by some people in South Africa in the last few days. This after Trump offered political asylum to white farmers.
Exactly. Actually, white Afrikaner farmers. So it's even more tribal than just white South Africans. So I would say that, South Africa emerged from this horrific experience of apartheid to create perhaps the world's, finest constitution, actually. It was the first country to make gay rights a constitutional an article of the Constitution, and so it goes on. So, yes, there is rule of law in South Africa now, and it rubs someone like Elon Musk the wrong way, because he is not able to do what he wants without impunity in a country like South Africa. It's the biggest trading partner the U.S. has on the African continent, I believe, maybe other than oil, but it's not a little penny ante country. It's a major power. It's a BRICS country, which is another source of tension with the U.S.
So now, because everything is transactional, let me ask you, Dan Hazelwood, this sort of blurring of the lines between business interests and politics, when Donald Trump slams Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator, does he do it because he wants a rare minerals contract, or because that's what he truly believes?
Well, I think the answer we have to look at on Trump on Ukraine is he actually seems to have been saying kind of the same thing for quite a long time. And he is not allied with defending Ukraine from Russian aggression like I think most of us here would prefer. He heads down his own path. I think the thing to look at here is, particularly when you look at the Musk-Trump relationship, everybody's getting very confused here, because the one thing that's certain is legally there's one person who's president, that's Trump. Egotistically, there's one person that if he ever decides that Musk is a problem, Trump will cut him loose in a flash. This is a perfect situation from Donald Trump's perspective of he's got Musk out there doing what many of the populist right has wanted, and conservatives, and frankly even Democrats, centrist Democrats in the United States have wanted for years, which is a thorough review of the government bureaucracy size. But Musk is willing to go in there in a fairly hard, abrupt, brutal fashion to reduce it, and Musk is the one taking all the heat. And weirdly, Trump is getting the credit politically from about the 60% of America who thinks this is a good thing. Musk is actually suffering the political consequences, and we're going to see them part ways down the road. Trump has actually already said that expires July 4th of 26. So we know this path is going to separate. This is actually pretty clever politics and pretty clever how you want to rapidly try and transform the government, which is Trump's vision.
You agree with that, Frederick Davis?
Well, we'll see. Look, what I find troubling, among other things, with this administration is the degree to which a lot of very, very, very wealthy people, including those who have a big hold on the media, all of a sudden have decided, maybe it's better to be friendly with this guy and work with him than otherwise. My cynical view of human nature is such that when you get that many really rich people in there, they're not thinking first necessarily about the public interest. I doubt very much whether Elon Musk will get out of this without becoming richer one way or another, and it looks like he already has in some ways. So I think that we're in a government that's inundated with these very, very, very wealthy people who have very powerful interests, and they're going to have an impact on how government is run. They're going to have an impact on politics, and I don't think it'll be a good one.
The same day that J.D. Vance, by the way, tweeted about the limitations of judges' powers, Donald Trump signed a decree freezing for 180 days enforcement of a post-Watergate-era law called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Officially, it's on hold so it can be synced with ways to go after foreign drug cartels. But the executive order claims that the 1977 law has been, quote, stretched beyond proper bounds and abused in a manner that harms the interests of the United States. Casey Michel, what does that mean, that it's been abused, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has been abused in a manner that harms the interests of the United States?
From Donald Trump's perspective, this law, which had been for decades the bedrock of the United States of America's anti-corruption playbook and really set the model for what anti-corruption legislation looked like. It was eventually modeled in Canada and the United Kingdom, as well as in France and the broader European Union. It's a very simple piece of legislation. It simply makes it illegal for Americans or American businessmen to bribe foreign officials. This was a rampant issue in the 1960s and the 1970s, and American legislators realized it's to the detriment not only of American interests themselves, but good governance around the world. Donald Trump does not agree. From Trump's perspective, this was a, quote, horrible law that hemmed in American businesses and American corporations who could no longer issue massive bribes to corrupt officials elsewhere. Now, of course, I disagree completely. I've written multiple articles. Part of my first book was about this piece of legislation itself, but this absolutely took a sledgehammer to not only the United States of America's anti-corruption bona fides, but the U.S.'s ability to target this kind of white-collar criminality that we have seen the Trump administration target elsewhere. Again, much of this goes back to what I've mentioned earlier, the elimination of any apparent independence out of the Department of Justice. But there are all manner of, again, knock-on effects that are going to be extremely concerning and, frankly, undercut American interests around the world.
Vivian Walt, plenty of examples throughout the years of how the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has been put to practice, the FIFA bribery scandal.
Absolutely. So I was just going to say, in relation to what Casey just said, it's not just American companies, right? You had bribe fines levied against Siemens, Airbus, all sorts of major global companies. And this is what's so kind of worrying in my mind about that and about his apparent moves to kind of redo the Securities and Exchange Commission. These are not just American companies. We're not in
because the dollar's the world's currency?
We're not in the 1950s anymore. These are global companies. You can barely say where their headquarters are anymore. The U.S. is the global trading currency. And every move that Total makes, for example, another country that was fined under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, every move that Total makes has to be reported to the SEC because Americans can buy Total stock. It's traded in the U.S. And so I kind of keep reading these things that Trump is doing as if he's kind of, living in a world that's, 50 years ago and not in current day reality.
Frederick Davis, the suspension of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act You're a member of the Paris Bar as well. What impact does it have for the rest of the planet?
Well, this is an issue of interest to me. I was a prosecutor here in the U.S. when the FCPA was adopted, and I work with it a lot. I've been advising some of the European prosecutors. And in my opinion, what Trump has been doing is stupid and counterproductive. The holy grail that we have been pursuing in the United States is the notion of a level playing field, the notion that when our companies compete against European and Asian companies, we compete on the basis of goods and price, not on who pays a bigger bribe, right? And for a long while, there wasn't a level playing field because the Europeans did not do a good job at enforcing their laws. What happened? Two things. One is our Department of Justice gleefully filled that gap. And as Vivian and others pointed out, we prosecuted Total, Alstom, Technip, a whole bunch of European countries, more than American ones, right? But the real thing that happened is that the Europeans improved their game. So they are now doing quite a good job. The implications of that are huge because right now, or at least until recently, our Department of Justice had a relationship of friendliness and respect with fellow prosecutors around the world. They have each other's weekend telephone numbers because they're pursuing the same goals with the same means. And for Trump now to say, after having pushed the Europeans in particular into going after this thing, well, we're out of here because we think Americans should be able to do more, that's just undercutting a very, very important part of our international diplomacy, namely relationships among prosecutors.
Dan Hazelwood, does this take the U.S. dollar from a position of global trust to a position where perhaps it's a currency instead that's feared? It'll still be weaponized, but not in the same way.
Well, there's been moves against the U.S. dollar and people wanting to come up with different plans for it for quite some time. You know, that's going to be based more realistically on the strength of the U.S. economy than on a lot of these other factors. I think your guest did a great outline of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and what its advantages are. I think what you have to look at is where I think the people who are critical of it have decided is that is a world that we would like to have, but they, in their view, that is a world that doesn't exist where China and other bad actors can go in there and play to the detriment of, frankly, Western democracies that have a rule of law and a capitalist system. And that is, I think, the resentment that Trump is trying to bring forward and put on the playing field. Is his argument is, look, much of the world is corrupt, and we get discriminated against because we try and be nice, and everybody else doesn't play by the rules. That is, I think, the worldview that they're trying to assert here. And I think one of the challenges that, and I've said this before on the program, that we in the broadly defined Western democratic capitalist countries have done a real poor job of articulating the benefits of our system, both to the peoples inside each of our nations and as well as the structure. And we've sort of taken joy in these structures without articulating to our constituents that this is a good thing for them on an individual basis. And that is where Trump and frankly many other world leaders in Western liberal democracies have come to the fore, criticizing this system because we haven't articulated its strengths.
Or is it just simply that he's a businessman who wants to make money?
I think he's a businessman who wants to make money, but he's also a businessman who has his own worldview that is a center-right populist worldview.
Center-right.
And and he is putting forward what he sees, and the people who talk to him, what their policies are. Just like other rich, other leaders of the United States have had very wealthy people talking to them about what the right course of action was. It was famously those people who led to the WTO and bringing China into the WTO because this was going to be good for American business. So this is, again, this is uncomfortable for all of us, but this is normal.
Casey Michel, it's true that politicians always have rich benefactors. Here in France, the president's come under scrutiny for his close ties with the country's richest man, Bernard Arnault, the owner of LVMH. But Bernard Arnault makes luxury goods. It's different if we're talking about tech titans?
Well, we've certainly never seen the rise of a kind of oligarchic class in the United States of America, at least like this. Certainly you can go back to the late 19th, early 20th century for the original plutocrats or tycoons or whatever terminology you would like to use to describe them. But what we have never seen, we did not see then, and we're only just seeing for the very first time in American history in the 2020s, is the enmeshment of those figures with political power in the United States of America. Of course, Donald Trump himself being a wildly wealthy, in some cases, certainly successful tycoon of his own right, opening the doors to the deepest pocketed individuals in the United States. Now, again, one of the difficulties with Donald Trump is trying to differentiate what he says versus what he does and what that portends moving forward. And Dan has made some great points about the kind of disagreements and discussions that have been taking place in the United States for decades in some of these spaces. Again, my concern moving forward is that Trump has already indicated a clear willingness to decimate the U.S.'s ability to target whether it's white-collar criminality, bribery writ large, especially the corporate variant, and again, anything else within that constellation of issues that these wealthiest benefactors are going to be benefiting from time and again. I will say, just as a final point, I think it's worth flagging as well, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act did not have support just in the good governance or anti-corruption community, but amidst a wide array of small and medium-sized American businesses that cannot compete with those deepest pocketed corporations that don't have the finances for that kind of bribery, but still saw the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act as something of a shield to go to corrupt governments that wanted those bribes and say, no, we cannot comply with your corrupt demands because we will be prosecuted. This is one of the knock-on issues, one of the downstream issues that I don't think President Trump has necessarily considered. But of course, that's just one of many effects that we're going to see moving forward.
Casey Michel, you're in New York, so before we go, let's talk about some local news. A U.S. judge will consider a request this Wednesday over whether to follow the Justice Department and dismiss the bribery case against the mayor of New York City. Trump's backing Eric Adams, who's accused of accepting campaign donations, most notably from Turkish nationals in exchange for influence. The Justice Department arguing that dismissal's needed so Adams can focus on helping Trump crack down on illegal immigration. Pushback could come from the courts. There you see the live images there outside of those courts, or from the Democratic governor of New York State, Kathy Hochul, who has the power to remove the mayor. Hochul stating that in the 235 years that the state has existed, these powers have never been utilized to remove a duly elected mayor. That said, the alleged conduct at City Hall that has been reported over the past 2 weeks is troubling and cannot be ignored. So, Frederick Davis, there's a lot in this story. On the one hand, do you see pushback coming from either a state, New York, against a decision made by the Justice Department or by the courts?
Well, see, it's an area I've thought a lot about and I've written about. Look, we have a Department of Justice that has a new Attorney General and a new Deputy Attorney General. They have said they do not want this case prosecuted. At the end of the day, they'll almost certainly prevail that issue because only the federal prosecutor can prosecute. They've been told not to, right? So that the real implications are, what happens. This judge could ask for a hearing. What's behind this? Is there a deal between Trump and Mayor Adams? The governor could remove him. There are other things could happen. I think he's a damaged property now politically, just because of all the people who've left his administration. I think the legal issue before the judge today is fairly limited. Namely, once the Department of Justice says he will not be prosecuted, there's really no mechanism to allow him to be prosecuted.
Frederick, could this happen in France, this sort of scenario where the president decides, let's drop charges against so-and-so? Is it something that happens now or could happen in the future? We have a presidential election in 2027 here.
Well, France has a very different system, and you fairly often have a situation where the prosecutor in France says, this should not go forward, and an investigating magistrate, and juge d'instruction, says, yes, it does. That happened to the French case against Dominique Strauss-Kahn, where the prosecutor did not want to prosecute, but it had to go ahead anyway. So the real difference is American prosecutors have virtually no judicial oversight of their decisions to prosecute or not prosecute, where in France and much of Europe they do.
Vivian Walt, we began at the beginning, you began by stating that this sort of atmosphere of grievance emanating from the White House. In this instance, this case with the mayor of New York, he wants the case dropped, what? Because they're friends?
Well, you know,
Because
it's
what?
Trump's town as well, don't forget, and a town from which he feels that he's been a little bit banished for the last 7-8 years. He's been unwelcome in New York circles for a long time, and it's his city. So I can imagine that, at least on the psychological level, there is some way in which he feels like he wants a hold on New York City. It's also, of course, you know, the powerhouse commercially in maybe the world. So, so on both those levels, I mean, I just want to pick up on one thing that was said. And, you know, it seems to me more from what Frederick was saying about the prosecutors. What really strikes me about the first month of Trump is it's kind of like a reign of bullying, almost. It's a reign of, you know, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to make your life so miserable that it's really not worth just like caving in and doing whatever I say. And, you know, there are many legitimate reasons why millions of people voted for Donald Trump. I mean, they had legitimate grievances, and we shouldn't forget that. I just don't know that they signed up for all of this.
Dan Hazelwood, can the executive orders keep coming at this pace for 2 or 4 years?
I would bet on it. I would bet he's going to keep coming because that's his strength. He is an aggressor. He has learned that in all walks of his life, that's the way to do it. There's a whole bunch of people, even people who were skeptical of him, are like, here's somebody who's actually doing this stuff. And I think him coming out there and pushing, you're going to see him keep pushing again and again. We're going to see it evolve as the team gets built up, as agency heads get approved, as Congress. We've got a big budget thing in the reconciliation that's going to affect a lot of this stuff that's just beginning to move through the legislative pipeline. All this stuff is going to keep coming. He believes that being at the center of the storm is his strength. Politically, you have to say he's been pretty successful with that so far. So I would say, you know, it's going to keep coming. And there's nothing that he has learned yet that says don't. And when you look at like what he's doing in New York, the other piece that's out there is a big part of his argument is, I am doing what everybody else does. I'm just telling you the truth about how I'm approaching it. So when Biden pardoned his son, he said political prosecutions. When Senator Menendez was convicted, a Democrat in New Jersey was convicted, he said it was a political prosecution. He goes through all these things to say, see, these are political prosecutions. They persecuted me with these prosecutions, and all these other people, these Democrats, are saying the same thing.
All right, so
this is a very intentional thought, and people should just be ready that it's not going to stop anytime soon.
Only the beginning. We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Dan Hazelwood, I want to thank you so much for being with us from Washington. I want to thank Casey Michel and Frederick Davis in New York. Vivian Walt, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.